Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our Adult Summer Reading Grand Finale program. Tonight, we're very fortunate to have an evening with Portland-based writer Peter Rock. My name is Bob Abbey. I'm an adult services librarian. There I am for the city of Forest Grove. And really pleased that you all can join us tonight. We are broadcasting live on our YouTube channel, and we are also streaming on Facebook, but we are primarily focusing on our YouTube channel. I want to talk a little bit about what we've got coming next couple of months as far as our programming is concerned. In addition to our program tonight, in September, on Tuesday, September 21st, at 6:30, we'll have a live stream program with Lee McIntyre, who is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and the History of Science at Boston University. He'll be joining us from Boston. He has a new book out called How to Talk to a Science Denier, and he's going to explain some of the research that talks about how to interact with someone who has science denial or really refuses to acknowledge the validity of science, and that a lot of the ways we think are the most appropriate or most effective for interacting with those folks turn out not to be true. So he's going to be talking about some of the latest research and some of the techniques that he has incorporated. And then in October, on Tuesday, October 12th, we have Portland author Omar El-Akkad joining us. Omar has a brand new book out called What Strange Paradise. Just came out within the last couple of weeks. Some of you may be familiar with Omar's first novel, American War. This is his second book, and it uses the Syrian refugee crisis as a backdrop. The story centers around a 9-year-old boy, and the story braids the past and the present, and a really powerful story of how the Syrian refugee crisis affects this young boy and also the people who he comes into contact with. So those two programs we have coming up. We do hope to see you then. But tonight, we are very fortunate to be hosting Peter Rock. I'm going to bring Peter into the stream. Hi, Peter.
Hello.
How are you?
Great, thank you.
So you're joining us from Portland. Where in Portland are you?
I'm down in Eastmoreland by Reed College.
Okay, all right. And I should remind folks that Peter does teach at Reed College. And we were chatting a little bit before the program started. School starts next week for you, and this is a very busy time as you prep to get ready for the upcoming term. So we appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to chat with us tonight and to talk about your novel, My Abandonment, which is a book that we have made available for summer reading. We've had some great responses from our community, and they're very interested in hearing you talk about it and asking questions about it. So I'm going to get out of the way, and I'm going to let you take over for a while, Peter. We'll be back at the end. I do want to remind folks that since this is interactive, this is live, please post your questions or comments in the comment section. You're not interrupting anybody. You're not bothering anybody. I'll monitor these while Peter's talking, and we can use those to generate some conversation at the end of the evening. And the last point is that we will be giving away a $50 McMinimans gift card tonight. I'm going to be drawing a name out of this very hat. So hang on for that. Peter, I will step out and let you take over, and I'll be back a little bit later.
All right. Thank you so much, Bob. Thank you, everyone, for reading my book, coming to hear me talk, even though we are being mediated through this screen. So I'm going to talk, and I'm going to read a little bit from the novel, My Abandonment. And then I'm going to kind of go back and forth between those two modes so as not to become too boring. And then I'm going to take questions, and I'm happy to talk about the book or the film Leave No Trace, which was made from the book, or other books of mine, or general writing questions, or anything at all. So as Bob said, just type your questions in the chat and we will get to that. It's always sort of curious to talk to authors about their work, I think, and I'm one of those authors who feels that most of what I have to say is in the books that I write, and I don't have a special grasp on what my books mean, or I can't always explain what the mysteries, what are the answers to the mysteries. But I can remember writing the books, and I can remember that period of time. And when I look back at them, I can kind of see what I was working through at that time. It's tricky. I mean, we really can't easily access the person who wrote this book because it was about 15 years ago that I finished writing it. And so it's fascinating for me to look back at it. And when I look at this book, what I see most of all is my anxiety about being a father. And I was racing the birth of my first daughter just as I finished this book. And of course, it's a book about a father and a daughter. And I was so worried about what kind of example I would be or how I would answer difficult questions, what it would be like to have a daughter. And now my daughter is 14 and I have another daughter who's 12. And I probably would have written a much different book had I been a father at that point. But this is the one that I wrote. When I'm teaching and when I'm thinking about my work, I often talk about inspiration, which is for me all about reaction. I used to have an idea of people being inspired as if electricity or lightning came shooting down from the sky through a person and you were transfixed and you were able to pass that on to the page. But I recognize I was talking to Bob right before the show about how I used to be a security guard in an art museum, and I would spend my time looking at the art and making up stories. And I think that's always been my strategy. I'm drawn to something I'm curious about, and then I see what comes out of me. And I'm often surprised. There's not a lot of thinking. I'm not that smart a person, but I'm receptive and I've been practicing a long time telling stories and putting words together. And so when I'm curious about something, when I'm drawn to something, I feel like there's something inside me that is resonating with whatever it is. So when I look back at the books that I've written, I could see Mormons and Mormon girls, taxidermy, pieces of my own life, my work as a subject in medical trials, art, etc. All kinds of different things drew me into them as a kind of investigation. And my research is very much about daydreaming and exploring and seeing what happens. So with my abandonment, the initial sparks were created by two newspaper articles. And probably some of you remember these articles or you remember the true story. And if you were to go to my website, the text of the articles is there and you could see what the background is. And the first article was about this father and daughter who were found living in Forest Park, this wilderness area, which is kind of inside of the city of Portland. And they had been living there for 4 years and they were very devoted to each other. And the girl tested ahead of where she should have been in school. And they had a garden and he was a veteran and was receiving, I think, disability checks. And they would walk out of the park and across the St. John's Bridge and get groceries and cash his checks. And they've been living this for quite a while. So I was fascinated by this story for a number of reasons, and I reacted maybe in the way that a lot of people did, in a paradoxical way. And so the first reaction of a lot of people when they read this story, when they heard about this father and daughter, was to celebrate the way that they were living, which seemed like a kind of judgment on the commodified and materialistic way that the rest of us live, and to say, these two people really care about each other. They're being successful in their way. They appreciate the life they have, and they have so little compared to the rest of us. And the paradox was that the second part of that instinct was, however, they can't go on living like this, and they would be much happier if they lived like the rest of us. So these two were taken out of the park, and he was given a job on a horse farm outside of Portland, and she was going to go to middle school in the fall. She was 13. And so that was all very fascinating. Then the second article, which I think was just maybe a month or so after that, 6 weeks, was about how the two of them had disappeared in the summer, and they'd left in the middle of the night and there was no trace of them. And so uh, that was fascinating too. But I think I was waiting for this third article, which would account for where they went, which would account for why they left, which would account for just some more facts about them. And at the time I was writing, this was 2004, I was writing a different book. I'll just pick it up for a demonstration. I was reading The Bewildered, and The Bewildered is a book about children living in Portland who are hired to steal copper wire from electrical lines and sell it. And they take their money and they hide it in Forest Park. So when I read the story of this girl and her father, I thought maybe I will incorporate this girl into the book that I'm writing, The Bewildered. And I did that. And she didn't have a whole lot to do in that book. What she did was she spent a lot of time watching the other characters. And so there are parts, if you've read my Abandonment, there's a part where she's watching these two kids play on top of this water tank. And that's a scene from The Bewildered. And the books are continuous or simultaneous. They happen at the same time. But when I was working on revising The Bewildered, I thought, this girl is too interesting and is not really doing too much. And so I took her out of that book, and then I wanted to see what she had to say. I wanted to see who she was and where she was going. And I'll talk a little bit more about the research and the preparation to write this book, but I think I'll just read from the very opening. And I think the reading I'll do tonight will be from the opening. So if you haven't read the book, I won't have to set it up and I won't give anything away. So this is the voice of the narrator, Caroline. Sometimes you're walking through the woods when a stick leaps into the air and strikes you across the back and shoulders several times, then flies away, lost in the underbrush. There's nothing to do but keep walking. You have to be ready for everything, and I am as I follow behind Father down out of the trees, around a puddle, to the fence of the salvage yard. It's night. Caroline, Father says, holding open a tear in the fence, you come through here. He begins to sort and scavenge. He wants rebar, metal to support our roof. I watch the road, the gate, and also behind us where we came through. Cars and big trucks rush and rattle past on the highway, the people inside staring straight ahead and thinking about where they are going and what will happen next, and probably things they've done before, but they're not thinking of or looking at us. There are no houses near the salvage yard, an electrical station humming inside its own fences, and then on the other side, Fat Cobra Video, which Father says is a snake store, but I don't think it is. In the window are pictures of ladies with their shirts off holding their breasts in their hands. Now he is pulling out the long, thin metal bars, setting the scraps of sheet metal aside. I hold Randy, my toy horse, in one hand. If I set him down, it's never for long. Randy and my blue piece of ribbon are always with me. You see, Caroline, Father says, all the work I'm doing here for these people, organizing all these different things. This is how we are paying them back for what we're taking. Yes, I say, squinting across the highway to the dark trains in the rail yard, the tiny lights of the cars on the bridge over the river. The rebar and wire are happy to be with us, since we will put them to better use and not forget them to rust in a pile. Father bends back the fence so you'd never know we were here. In one hand, I carry a roll of wire that will help hold up the roof, or which we can bend to a hanging shelf or another secret thing he might make. And in my other hand is Randy softly rattling with the things I put inside his hollow body. My finger is over the round hole in his stomach. Caroline, Father says, don't lag. I'm right here, I say. Father keeps backtracking since it's hard to carry the long pieces of rebar through the trees in the dark. They keep snagging on things, turning him sideways. If you look up at the sky, I say, you can see the spaces between the trees that way and see where to walk. Thanks, he says. Who do you think taught you that? At night, the air smells less dry, the coolness in the trees. A branch clatters down, becoming a stick. Squirrels up there, an owl. Everything in the darkness reaches out in its way, and at night we wear shoes, so it's harder to feel how things are. We go deeper into the forest park, further from the edge where the city leans in. I know where we are. I know the way home and where I would end up if I walked 30 minutes in any direction through the forest. If I hold my breath and let Father walk away, I can't even hear his footsteps, even in his shoes. That's how good he is. Then the air is thick and rotten. Father's hand is on my arm. I hear the click, and then his headlamp is bright and round on his forehead. He holds back a tangle of blackberry, and I step through, and on the ground is a deer with its neck bent back and its eyes missing and blood on its black nose. The light is a 5-inch white circle sliding across the deer, its head, its hooves, its tail. The deer is about the size of me, its tan fur smooth, flies bouncing and buzzing. Its stomach is open and some parts are missing. That's her liver, Father says, pointing with a stick, sharp black against the light. Lungs, heart. The dogs did this, I say, the smell. Hold your breath, Father says. I doubt it was dogs or coyotes. Someone might have shot her or disease, or she could have fallen down here and broken her neck. Even animals can fall down sometimes. I know that, I say. Look carefully, Caroline. There's a lesson here. It's a better homework than being in school, that's for certain. Father turns his neck to look at me before I can shut my eyes against the brightness, and it blinds me. I hear the switch, so I know it's off. But still the light is in my eyes, and they take a moment to clear, and we can walk again. So how to tell this story, I wondered when I began to approach it, and could I? It was kind of a side project of another book I was writing because I wasn't sure I wanted to write a book told by a girl. I wasn't sure I could do it. I had ethical questions about writing a story that was based on a real story with real people in it, which I could talk more about. I was working on a book about a character named Nameless who appears in this book. And it's a book I never published, but it's a book about a man who is trying to become feral, is trying to become more of an animal and less of a person, and won't speak and won't do things that most people do. And ultimately, I finished both books and I sent them off to my agent. And in the time it took him to read them, which was quite a while, I changed my opinion, and I felt like this book had more of its own thing going on. It had more of its own obsession. And so that's how it came to be and how I overcame some of my hesitations about it. I often say, and it's true, that when I write something, when I write a book, when I write a story, probably about 30 or 40% of the time I spend is preparing to write it, which is daydreaming, researching, gathering things. And then probably about 10% of the time I spend writing a draft of something. And then the rest of the time, maybe half the time I spend revising. So a book like my Abandonment was much different at sometimes. It was like most things I write quite a bit longer when I wrote the first draft. And finding its form was something that, I thought it ended more quickly than I thought when I finished this particular draft. So how to approach this story was just sort of, first of all, trying to figure out who this girl was. And I had the opportunity early on when I was writing the book to talk to people who were involved in the real story. The cross-country runner who first saw the girl, the detective who worked on the case. And I had things set up. And then at the last minute, I decided, no, I don't really want to know any more than I know. I'm not a nonfiction writer. I work well with a little bit of information, and I don't want to get closer to the actual people. I want to get closer to a story that I want to tell. And there actually are a couple other books that are based on or inspired by the same story. And one of the authors actually did those interviews and did write a very different kind of book, I think, because of it. So I spent a lot of time in Forest Park, just climbing trees, imagining what the day-to-day life was like, what were the rules, what were the limits, what was known, what was unknown. I would run into people way back in Forest Park, and the interactions I had sometimes found their way into the book. But I was just sitting up in trees, imagining that I was this girl. And at the same time, I was surrounding myself with the things that I thought she might have. And I was picking up on little clues in the newspaper article. So I was sort of thinking about encyclopedias. I was reading encyclopedias. I was reading Golden Nature Guides, which are a very small book that I used to have when I was a child, which I really wanted to get back and read those again. And I was taking notes all along the way. So there are notes about things like mammals or stalactites, which are notes that I was writing at that time that I didn't know would find their way into the book. But eventually, she, as a narrator, is a bit of a magpie and is taking things. The thing she talks about, Randy, who's here, is her horse that she does math. He's an acupuncture horse model, but she doesn't know this. I think in my mind, I believe that maybe Caroline wanted a My Pretty Pony or some kind of toy like that, and her dad instead gave her this horse, which is the anatomy is visible on one side, and all the acupuncture points are on the other side. So she does her math with this horse and has a hole in it, hollow, that she hides things in there, which is important later in the book. So all the time that I was working on this book and writing it, like I always had Randy next to me, and I had the ribbon, and I had all of Caroline's things. So I didn't have to think about being anyone except Caroline in that time. And as I gathered more and more information, I'm jumping a little bit ahead of myself because I didn't know who would narrate this story. And when I'm teaching, I always say to the students, any given story or any gathered amount of information will be so different based on who's telling the story and what they have at stake in that moment. And the more I thought about what I loved about the potential in this story and the real story I'd read, it was about this girl and about her wonder. And I think that I know for a fact that I've never been a 13-year-old girl, but I know that a lot of the things that she is concerned with, like how to not be alone, how to not be lonely, how to find a friend, how to deal with a parent who has a lot of dictums and a lot of rules and a lot of unpredictable behavior, and how to process that. Those things are all very much familiar to me. And as I drew her closer to me and as I thought about her voice, I realized what is central to this book for me is it sort of is a sense of wonder. And one great thing that a young narrator can do for us is to transport us back to being younger and to having experiences for the first time and to being, amazed. And as adults reading a book that is being told by a young narrator, we know more than they do and we have more perspective. So part of the complication there is that we worry and we see the darker side of the story and we see this fear. I was thinking the other day about country music. Often in country music, there's very sad lyrics and very happy music, or very sad music and happy lyrics, but more often sad lyrics and happy music, I think. And that sort of is one of the tensions. Like I always felt like My Abandonment was such a happy book because for Caroline, it is kind of a triumph, and she is, wondering at the world, and she is amazed, and she believes in her father. The reader might have a different experience or a different understanding. So before I talk a little bit about some of the strategies I use to get into this voice, I'm going to read just a little bit more. I'm going to pick up where I left off. A little further on, Father stops at a good place where it is finally not so steep and sets everything down. He pulls up the ivy around and over it, even though almost no one would come here, find, or want to be able to carry it. There, he says, we've done it again, Caroline. We step only on the stones closer to home, I on every one, Father on every second one, to not beat down the grass. We come around the side and carefully he takes away the branch from the front door, and then we sit on the edge of the mattress for a moment before he strikes a match and lights the lamp. The lamp is made out of a glass bottle with fuel in it, and a string stuck through into it. Its light shines, and deeper back in the cave, the gold letters on my encyclopedia shine back. I only have up to L, but I haven't read past E. I go into F or G or the future ones when something's mentioned that starts with that letter. My dictionary is there too. It's a paperback book and smaller. Inside, the ceiling is tall enough that I can stand on my knees, but Father has to sit down or crawl. He pulls the branch back across the door and looks at me. We're lucky, he says. We're the lucky ones. We are, I say. We have to be so careful these days, he says. Why, I say. People. No one knows where we are, I say. If you think that way, Father says, that's when you get caught, overconfident. No one's ever caught us, I say. No one could. That doesn't mean anything, he says. You know better than to look to the past, Caroline. I set Randy on his wooden base with the one metal post the size of a pencil that fits in the hole in his stomach. I turn his white side out so I can look up and check on him in the darkness, and he'll be easy to see from the mattress. The dinner dishes are all dry now, and I stack them on their shelves. Father takes off his dark forest pants and mends a rip with a piece of dental floss and a needle. Then he writes down things from the books he's reading in his tiny handwriting in his little book, and I do some homework he's given me, and I also write on the scrap of paper some of this journal and things I've seen and thought. Father, his hand spread out, is wider than this sheet of paper, wider than the plates we eat off, his fingertips hanging over. It makes a book look tiny when he holds it. We brush our teeth and spit in the chamber pot and change out of our clothes and lie down on the mattress. Father stretches his hands over his head so they almost reach the flat stone and the green Coleman stove. Sometimes in his sleep, his hands cross and his wrists come together and his bracelets ring softly. They're supposed to help him to be stronger. When I tell him I need help to be stronger, he says that I haven't seen all the things or had the problems he's had. He says I'm too young to wear jewelry. He turns over to kiss me, his scratchy cheek. If a paragraph is a thought, a complete thought, then a sentence is one piece of a thought, like an addition where one number plus another number equals a bigger number. If you wrote down subtraction, you would start with a thought and take enough away that it was no longer complete. You would write backward or nothing at all or less than nothing. You wouldn't even think or breathe. A comma, that is a place you breathe or think, which is how breathing and thinking are the same. They collect or are places to collect. A semicolon is a strange way of thinking that I don't understand. It is more than one sentence inside one sentence. It makes more sense to me just to let each sentence be a sentence. Father says both the pieces on either side of a colon should add up to the same thing, even if one side is just a list. Some of the things I need to write about: Randy, the lookouts, bodies, names, nameless, people when they think they're alone, snow, trampolines, helicopters. So when I set out to write this book, I had published several books before, and I'd written many, many more books than I'd published. And I looked back at the things that I'd written that I was proud of, and I recognized that I did have certain tendencies and I did have a certain style. And one thing that I really abused, or one thing that I really loved, was semicolons. And semicolons were kind of the place where I, as a writer, equivocated or undercut what I said or complicated it in some way. And so as I was making rules for how clocks worked for Father and Caroline, or how far they could range during the course of a day, I was also making rules about how Caroline could write. And that little paragraph about grammar is one of the first things that I wrote, maybe the first thing that I wrote in the book. And I didn't really expect it to be part of the book when I wrote it. I just wanted to sort of set out some rules. And it made such a big difference. And ostensibly, I'm an English professor, so I should have seen this coming. But taking the semicolon away from myself changed the shape of the sentences. And of course, sentences make up paragraphs. And if paragraphs are complete thoughts or incomplete thoughts, the way the thinking worked is really foreign to me and really different. And the way things sped up and the way things slowed down kind of turned into Caroline's style, which is, even reading it now, I feel like I'm very much Caroline in those moments, or I'm very much traveling in her voice. It's not something that is recognizably mine to me. I still had a couple other things in mind. I was reading a lot of wouldn't say similar kinds of books, but one of the books I was reading was a book by Opal Whiteley called The Singing Creek Where the Willows Grow, which is a great and very strange book written by, it's a nature journal of a girl who lived down around Corvallis, I believe, at the turn of the 20th century. And in her nature journal, she ranges through describing the natural world with such delight. And she also has interactions with a lot of fantastic characters. And it turns out, another reason I really love that book, that for most people, they recognize that book as a hoax that Opal Whiteley wrote later in her life and then brought out later in life as something she wrote when she was young. And some people would argue that. But it's in moments such a beautifully written book. And it's one of the epigraphs from my Abandonment is from that book. So I'll read a little tiny paragraph, which is the epigraph, so you can get a sense of how much I stole from Opal Whiteley. Very soon after, I saw a little snake. He was crawling along. When I see snakes, I like to stop and watch. The dresses they wear fit them tight. They can't fluff out their clothes like birds can. But snakes are quick people. They move in such a pretty way. Their eyes are bright and their tongues are slim. So one of the things also that is a predicament no matter what, those of you who write know this, when you're writing in the first person, when you have a narrator who's filtering everything that happens and controlling everything that happens in a story, it sometimes is hard to find dimension for other characters or to allow them enough space to become real. And so often the answer is through dialogue and through action. And certainly Father is the other big character in this story. And we can only understand Father as Caroline does. So he has to be talking and he has to be speaking as much as possible. And I think that there's a mention in that little section I just read that he's writing things down from books he wrote. And later on, she gets hold of that journal and she starts reading pieces of it. And I'll read just a tiny paragraph late in the book where it's a section from his journal. If one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams, he will meet with success unexpected in common hours. He will pass an invisible boundary. Don't forget this. Don't forget that thinking can get in the way. Forget the forgetting. We seek to forget ourselves, to be surprised and to do something without knowing how or why. The way of life is wonderful. It is by abandonment, which I believe is where the title came from. And it's very unclear because it certainly is not cited any place in the book. But that whole section is part of an essay by Ralph Waldo Emerson, transposed and interpolated with the Father's thoughts. And I was reading a lot of the things that I read when I was a senior in college. So I read a lot of Thoreau and I read a lot of Emerson, and who are, of course, transcendental writers and often write beautifully about the natural world and our relationship to it, but read in a slightly different way or read from a slightly different angle. They're kind of misanthropic and cranky. And so I was reading these books as Father was reading them, someone who can't live in civilization, someone who doesn't want to interact with civilization as he knows it. So that was one way for me to help understand or to empathize with Father as I was writing the book. And another way was, I'm looking at the time. I might just read a little tiny bit. A big, not a big statement and not a big insight really, but when we want to get to know someone, we talk with them. We have a conversation, and often conversations that are about small things are the most illuminating. So before I wrote this book, or before I started putting the narrative together, I spent a lot of time writing conversations between Caroline and Father about all kinds of things, favorite colors, questions of, preference of various kinds. And those sometimes found their way into the book and sometimes they didn't. So I'll read the last part of this little section I've been reading from right after the section about grammar. Wake up, I say, you were having a dream. Was it the helicopters? Whoa, Father says, I guess it was a dream. I can't see the moon, I say, it's dark outside tonight. Clouds, he says, maybe it'll rain tomorrow. Was it the helicopters, I say? Oh, Caroline, he says, they swarmed all down over the trees, rattling and tearing at everything. They had loudspeakers, and from above they cast the sound of a baby crying, so loud, crying the edges breaking up. Why? This was in your dream? No, this was before, he says. I don't know. Why would they do that, I say. Exactly. I don't know. Sleep, Caroline. In the summer, like now, we sleep on top of the sleeping bags with only a sheet over us, and in the winter, we zip the bags together since it's warmer that way. When my body was smaller, there was lots of room, but even when it's too warm, I cannot get away. Our legs touch our arms. I can't fall asleep, and I can't tell if Father is asleep or not. I keep thinking of the deer dead, lying half a mile away, listening while different animals drag parts of her away. Father does not grow, but he is the largest man in the forest park, and I have seen bigger than anyone in the city except very fat men who cannot move like he moves. I am also quick, but much more slender and 5 feet tall, my dark hair long and snarled, and my skin white so it can flash in the darkness if I am not careful. All at once there's a whining, a snarling, and then a snuffling as a snout pushes through the branch across our door. It's the dogs, some of them, racing through our camp, and Father shouts once and bangs a pan with a spoon, and they're gone that fast, but I know that he's awake. I name the head dog Lala, I say. If she's such a good friend of yours, he says, you could tell her that we try to sleep around here at night. I was thinking about the deer, I say, the dead one. What about her, he says. Nothing, I say, the bottoms of my feet on his leg. What is your favorite color? What's yours, he says. Yellow, I say. Why, he says. The way it makes me feel, it's bright and not still. Exactly, he says, it draws attention. I like green. You would, I say, and he laughs and holds me close. And what was my mother's favorite color, I say. Yellow, he says, just like yours. So she taught me that, I say, for it to be my favorite. Probably, he says, kind of, some way. You're very much like her. And we have the same name, I say. Had, he says, yes, Caroline. Why did you give me the same name, I say. Because I loved her so much. Now go to sleep. It's the middle of the night, Caroline. I always tell you that. I wish I could have met her, I say. She wishes that too, he says. Good night, Yellow. Good night, Green, I say. So thank you so much. When I look, I guess that's pretty much what I have to say, and I can field questions. When I read that section, I think when I watch the film Leave No Trace, there's very little dialogue from the book in the film. And that little section of talking about colors was one of the first things I wrote for the book, but it's a part that does happen in the film. And whenever I watch the film, I think, oh, now it's getting really good. Like this is the good part of the film because they're using my dialogue. So yes, thank you so much for listening. And I'm ready to field questions if they exist.
Well, thanks, Peter. I really enjoy hearing you read your own words. And I want to remind folks that you can post your comments or questions in the comment section, and we'll get to those throughout. We've had a couple already. One of the things that struck me about the very beginning of the book, and maybe you can talk a little bit about this, is how in this very unusual situation, there's a sense of normalcy about everything, right? It's the way everything is described, just sort of going about their business. It's a sort of a domestic activity, but it's in a very different kind of environment. Was that a conscious choice, or how did you approach dealing with that sense of place and these characters' relationship to it?
That's a good question. I think, when I'm telling a story, I'm always looking for a limit. I'm looking for, because there's a tendency to spread out and try to do everything at once. There's a tendency to try to comment on things or have some commentary. And part of this story is, there's a danger for it to be a story that is very thick with commentary, or that seems to be sensationalistic, or that is describing something from outside. So as a storyteller, I often come back. One of my favorite writers is Julio Cortázar. who wrote Hopscotch and who wrote Blow Up. And he wrote a short essay called On the Environs of the Short Story. And in that essay, he opens with this quotation from Horacio Quiroga, which is, tell the story as if it is only of interest to the small circle of your characters, of which you may be one. There's no other way to put life into a story. And so when I'm writing, whether or not it's a first person narrator, I'm always trying to tell the story from inside the story. And I'm never thinking about readers. I'm trying, I mean, the reason I think that most people make any kind of art or garden, or, I mean, it's just to lose ourselves and to forget who we are. So it's sort of, when I was writing the opening of the book and when I was trying to exist as Caroline, I wasn't simultaneously wondering how people would take it, or I wasn't trying to contextualize it, because I knew different readers would bring to it their own lives and to bring, their own experience. There's a familiar kind of world, and maybe it's almost implicit that most people who would read a work of literary fiction are living in a pretty domestic, urban, suburban sphere almost. So it's already a contrast, but it's the only world that these characters know. It's not the only world that Father knows, but it's the only world that Caroline knows. And she appreciates it. And she loves it in different ways. So it's sort of, being aware that she doesn't have to account for things she doesn't know about, and that the way she understands things is pretty tightly controlled by Father in the book too. So those are some thoughts along those lines.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it seems to also, when you talk about that sense of wonder, this idea that all of the things that are happening in this story, that we really are kind of perceiving these through Caroline's eyes,
Mm-hmm.
and that the challenge, I would guess, as a writer is to sort of tip your hand and to kind of steer us in a direction so that we have a specific reaction. But we're discovering a lot of this at the same time that she is. And
Mm-hmm.
so that creates, I mean, as I reread the book, I mean, I know what happens, but still that sense of, I don't know what happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm perceiving this through her. So we have a couple of folks who are interested in the relationship between the book and the movie, and we talked before about some of those. One other question that's come up is about the settings and just the fact that the story ranges over a large geographical space, right? We go from Portland to Boise. What kind of research did you do, or how much did you get into finding out about those places and the things that were there?
I mean, I think there's a little bit of, I wouldn't say happenstance, but there's sort of like, writers often know about the things that, they write about the places that they know pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
But I did go, like, I knew there was a little part in Boise, and I have friends in Boise, so it's sort of a reason to see friends. So I went and walked around there, and I figured out kind of how I wanted it to be. There's a large part of this book that takes place down around Sisters, and that wasn't really by design. But when I began writing this book, I went down to Caldera, which is an artist colony, and I used to be on the selection committee, so I could clear out time to be down in those A-frames by myself. So when I began writing my Abandonment, it was right after. Now there's so many fires all the time, but it was sort of, 2005, after the Biscuit Fire, I think, is sort of, and that whole landscape was kind of burned out. I was walking up around Subtle Lake and Blue Lake and up in there, and I just spent 3 or 4 weeks where I didn't have to talk to anyone else, and I could just pretend that I was this girl or be this girl. And I don't think that landscape would have existed in this book if I hadn't been there. I didn't know where the book went exactly, but I was sort of curious, if they had to flee Forest Park and they left Portland, which direction would they go? And so there was a lot of kind of my lived experience of walking around. And I do a lot of swimming also, but not at the time of writing this book, but it's sort of actually moving around and just letting things settle I'm a big believer in sort of working in small increments and letting your unconscious work it out. I'm always taking notes and seeing where things go. But physical activity and geography and being in a place certainly informed the way that I went about things. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So one question we got is about the way you depict Caroline and her father as non-meat eaters, and the question is that something that is based on actual fact, or was that just a part of your creation of these characters?
I don't know. I think it was part of my creation. I just felt like it would be hard to. I think it's probably not true, but I think it was sort of easier. And I think I wanted to create, a series of ethics around sort of the way that they lived, which is romanticized, no doubt. Probably they were incredibly hungry and they would eat what they could.
Mm-hmm,
But yeah, so it wasn't based on anything I knew to be fact.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it sounds like there's not a lot that we know about these two individuals. I read something where we know their names, but
Mhm.
that there's just not much else there. So that kind of gives some poetic license for fleshing them out.
Mhm.
The So a couple questions about the movie, and I guess before I get into these questions,
Mhm.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that process of having something that you've written, which exists in a medium, and having it transferred to another medium.
Mhm.
What are some of the what is that like in terms of how you envision something and being able to sort of let go of this finished product as it moves into this next medium?
Did Willie Vlotton talk about this?
I don't remember. I don't think so.
Maybe the film wasn't out yet. It's very it's tough because I'm going to start complaining about this, and then everyone is going to feel like, oh, here's a person complaining about someone making a really good film of his work and giving him money, which sounds really bad. It's interesting when I well, I won't even talk about that, but I was just thinking, Deborah Granick, who made the film, also made the film of Winter's Bone, and so I was sort of a little bit in touch with Daniel Woodrell, who wrote that book, and it seemed pretty hard. Having been on a movie set now and seeing how a film is made, it's really hard to be a film director. You have to be a bit of a dictator, and you have to juggle a lot of things. And probably the last thing you want in the world is the author of the novel you're adapting in your face or in your ear, or raising questions about things. And when I was on set, I would see Deborah and I would see her at lunch and I would say, "Oh, I've been watching. I have a lot of ideas for you." And I would see her face just change into a stone mask. But I would say, I'm kidding. Like, this is it's your deal. Um, so I guess it's a best case scenario where someone, and it harkens back to what I was saying about reaction, where someone takes something that I've made and they react to it and make something of their own. And so it's, I think, a pretty good film. I like it. I struggle with it, and is really very uncomfortable experience. And I could have, I guess, intellectually, I knew it was going to be this way, but I couldn't have foretold how it felt to see things changed or to not be asked about things, or all kinds of ways that my feelings were hurt. But there's a reason why people are always saying, oh, the book was better than the movie. And that is that when we read a book, we populate it, we visualize it, we see what the people look like for us, and a lot of that comes out of our own lives also. And so when that range of possibilities is limited by an actor or an actress or the way a voice sounds, it's tough. And having been reading from this book and knowing, whether or not it succeeds for people, it's a very voice-driven book. It's very much about that voice. And unless it's going to be a film that is driven by voiceover, which no one wants to see, it can't have that. So it's sort of, I think the cinematography, the light, the music in the film, they do similar things as the language, and it's often quite beautiful the way that that film looks and sounds. Um, and I think that there are things that happen in the book that would be hard to show. Um, there's a way in which this book is retrospective. By the time you get to the end of the book, you realize that Caroline is retelling it. And that would be really annoying in a film too, I think. And so um, I could go clearly on and on about this. Like, one interesting thing about the film, which I think is pretty rare, is that the film was shot chronologically. And so often I think you'll have access to an actor and you've got to film the end and then you've got to work back to it. And so they could start verging away from the book pretty early, and the script was pretty loose, and kind of depending on what was happening with the actors or with the weather or what, anything could push it a little bit further away. So recognizing how that drift was kind of organic and how much changed in editing, and then just again, a really complicated experience, but amazing to see on the set how many people are there at a very small film, 100 people on the crew to run everything and to arrange everything. And I thought, not in a really hubristic way, wow, like when I'm writing something, all of this is in my head. Like I'm arranging all of these things at once. But I used to, and I still do a little bit, work on adaptation and, take a thing from one medium into another. And film is such a visual, such a strange way of telling a story that I think often, the author is not the best person to try to make that adaptation or to try to change it. I mean, I did this, I told this story the best way that I could with the skills that I've developed over the course of my life. And I'm not a filmmaker. So I've been different places talking about the film, and people say, well, what if you made the film? Well, it wouldn't be very good and no one would want to see it. It's sort of, I'm not a filmmaker. So I could talk more about the film, but that's the beginning.
So we have a couple of questions that actually get to the end of the book, and I'm trying to figure out a way to phrase these that isn't too spoilery.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the gist of the question is, and this may be a way to approach this, is again to think about something you mentioned with the narrator, with Caroline as the narrator, and that we perceive things through her.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of people have asked about the relationship that she has with her father and the introduction of the foster family.
Mm-hmm.
And this sort of maybe a sense of not quite knowing what is true and whether what Caroline knows about the situation is actually, in fact, the situation. That's an awful way of phrasing a question that just doesn't get too spoilery, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that particular part of the book and where we sort of encounter Caroline's relationship with her family, and then her father
Mm-hmm.
comes into the, he's sort of inserted into the story, and we sort of then pick it up in a different thread. How are we to perceive that relationship?
Yeah, it's hard not to really go into it. I think various people have different understandings of this. Say, my mother and I have different understandings of it. Caroline and I have different understandings of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is a big place in the story where the way Caroline perceives things, and this is sort of, people often talk about unreliable narration, or my students often love this idea of the unreliable narrator. And I think it's sort of misunderstood often because no reader wants to feel like they're being jerked around. Often a narrator will tell the story the only way they can tell it to survive. the only way that they can tell it where they can live with it. And they will stick to it. And the reader might see that that version of the story is veering from the facts in significant ways, but the narrator is not necessarily going to see that. And so there are ways in which I tried to, at the end of the book, allow Caroline to have insights about her life, about her past. And maybe it's a time where, like, the story is told for the most part in the present tense. And even in the section that I read, I mean, Father is saying, Caroline, you know better than to think about the past. And he wants her focused on the present and on the future. He doesn't want her thinking about the past. And when she is finally by herself, memories can come back to her. Like she starts thinking about the past in a certain way. There's a section a little later in the book after they're relocated when, I'm trying to think of the time. It's not a long story. And it allows me to talk about how I know Ursula Le Guin, or knew Ursula. So that's exciting. But when she's taken away, she's given a copy of A Wizard of Earthsea, which is one of my favorite books, and a book that my dad read to me when I was growing up. And maybe, one of the main reasons I became someone who writes is Ursula Le Guin. And so there's a little passage about, knowing your true self, and it's about names in my book from that book. And my publisher said, you have to ask Ursula to use this passage from her book. And I had seen her around. I was kind of afraid of her, and I understood that she did not suffer fools gladly. So I said to the publisher, well, you are her publisher also. Could you ask her? And they said, no, we're afraid of her. You ask her. So eventually I sent her a postcard, or I sent her a letter, and she wrote back and said, I think I would have to see the book. And she, so I sent her this pile of paper, and she read it, and her husband read it. She really liked it. And she lived right against Forest Park. So she knew the story, and she wanted to have lunch. And so we had lunch, and I was ready. I was got some new clothes, I think. I was ready to just accept her compliments about my book. But what she wanted really to do was talk to me about the present tense, and talk to me about why the book was in the present tense, see if I could convince her that it was a good idea, because she thought it was lazy. The present tense keeps you in an immediate moment. It makes things, but it's a bit of a construct. And I think, as we talked about it, and as I've been talking about it now, it's sort of like the nature of how truths are revealed or kept from Caroline in this story are kind of about staying in the present. And I think Ursula pretty much agreed with that, but she was just it was very much like talking to God about the present tense, and talking to someone who had been in a storytelling situation a million times and had to make a call on who's the narrator, what's the tense, how does time work in the story. And all of these technical questions are emotional questions. They're really about emotional affect in a story. And so recognizing that Ursula was sort of had done everything, and it was like the most amazing writer I ever knew, and just wanted to talk about grammar more than anything else, was illuminating to me, which is a digression from your question. But I think it is a troubling ending, and it's a very different ending than the film. I think they did not want to go into that particular area of the book.
Well, no, I mean, honestly, I could listen to stories about Ursula K. Le Guin all night. So, don't worry about the digression. That's a great story. When you talked about the story told in the past tense, and again, rereading it, one of the things that struck me is, I mean, that's a difficult and not very often used conceit, right? That you have a story that seems to be unfolding in the present, but it's actually being told back. I mean, the character is older and is kind of telling it, and you feel like you're in the present tense, but you're actually hearing it. And it reminded me of True Grit, which is exactly the same thing, right? We have Maddie Ross, who is telling this story as an older woman, in her case, an old woman. But the voice is very much, she's well, Charles Portis. She isn't, but Charles
Mhm.
Portis is telling this story and using the voice of a young woman, and then it's like an older woman telling the story as a younger woman. So that was a conceit that struck me as I read this again. Is that you have this story being told backwards, but the voice is very much in the present, and that's a tough. I would think that's a very tough thing to do.
I think I mean, in a best case scenario, when I'm writing something, a lot of surprises happen. So I
Mm-hmm.
was writing the story in the present tense, and I didn't know if I would ever get to the past tense. I didn't know how it would end. I didn't know what the turn would be exactly. So
Mm-hmm.
I was as surprised as anyone else with some of the things that happen at the end of the book, and what why Caroline was withholding them, which seemed like natural sort of defensive positions. But I think there are a lot of ways in which I tried to change. I wrote this ending so many times, and I tried to change the way things went. And there's a scene, without giving anything away, when she sees her sister in Boise and she does not go and talk to her. And I tried to keep getting her to walk across the street, and she could not do it. And I was talking about the book one time on the radio, and a child psychologist called in and said, at that age, when you're 12 or 13 or 14, your sense of the world and your place in it and how things work starts to solidify, and it's hard to change it past that point. It's hard to change the way you understand your relationship to other people in the world. It doesn't happen. And so I had, of course, thought this through, but there were a lot of insights and a lot of things that I thought Caroline should, that I wanted her to have. There are things I wanted her to do that I could not get her to do, or that I failed as someone who was writing through her to realize, because I think there are ways in which Father taught her that will always be with her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hmm. We do have a couple more questions, but before we get to those, we want to take a little break. We want to make sure to get the drawing. I feel like
Yeah.
this is such a weird change in tone, right? But so we have a $50 gift card for McMinimans. Thanks to everybody who participated. I actually have names in a hat, right? This is really old fashioned. So I'm just going to reach in. This is like totally low tech. I'm not even looking to see what I'm doing. So our $50 McMinimans gift card goes to Belinda. Belinda, if you're watching right now, could you please hit the like button? Let us know that you're watching. Belinda, we will get this gift card to you. I'll reach out to you tomorrow or in the next couple of days, and we will find out how to get that to you. So congratulations, Belinda, for your $50 McMinimans gift card.
Oh,
Okay, now,
yeah.
yeah,
Congratulations, Belinda. That's great.
yeah. Um, so I still have lots and lots of questions about my abandonment, and I feel like we could talk a lot about these. I guess the one question that has sort of weighed on me as I was reading this is, given our current moment and given where we are with encampments, and given where we are with so many people experiencing housing insecurity, so many people who are dealing with trauma, and who are for a variety of reasons living on the margins. Um, as you think about that, and as you think about this book, do you revisit these characters in that sense? I mean, how should someone reading this book now um, reconcile a 15-year-old book with what's
Mhm.
happening now? I mean, does it provide us with any additional insights into um, someone who is living on the margins or is experiencing trauma?
Wow, that's a big question. I don't know. I do have some thoughts about that. It's sort of, I mean, one of the interesting things for me about having the film made was when the filmmakers came to Portland, because they were making a film, I guess, they had so much more access to things, or people were so, I mean, I'm a furtive person anyway, but I was able to go with them, and we walked around in Forest Park quite a bit. But the rangers and the Forest Park Conservation Group, they opened all the gates and they drove us back in, and they showed us where all the encampments have been and kind of recounted the history of Forest Park, through the eyes of people who are unhoused. And it is sort of depending on the administration, and even within administrations in Portland, it's very uneven. They move everyone out, that then they allow people to stay, then they move them out. So it's very unpredictable in that way. I would hope, I mean, I have never been in this situation. There's something condescending about me writing about it. Certainly people in my family have, and I've wondered and worried about them, and I've wondered what was going on. And so part of what a fiction writer does is to wonder and imagine and to try to explore a world, and the effects of that on other people and readers is hard to say. I will say that to humanize people that we do not always see as human, I think is something that's important. I think there are people who do a lot more than my book has ever done to raise consciousness or think about it. I think of, say, the people at Street Books, who I really admire, who spend a lot of time on their bicycles delivering books to the unhoused, and to recognize that for, in significant ways, and I really love my book, and I'm glad that I wrote it. It's a fantasy, and the film is a fantasy of the book, and so there are certainly darker realities. There are certainly reasons to hope, and there are sort of the hope, I guess, for me is just to deal with individuals as individuals and as people, and to try to figure out the small and the large ways that we can help, whether it's giving money or, supporting groups that are helpful, or just being kind when we have a chance. So it's a big question. And I feel like the ethics of writing this book, or the ethics of writing across class, I think is a question that I feel uncomfortable about. And I know that I write at my best when I'm uncomfortable, when I'm not quite sure if I can do it, or if I should do it. And when I first read from my abandonment at Powell's, someone got up and said, "How could you write this book? You took her voice." And all the writers in the room were like, "Wait a minute, like that's what we do." and But I felt like that's a good question. Like I've never really forgotten that. Like I've never really felt at the same time as I clearly wrote the book, and I'm happy to talk about it. And I feel like I'm at peace with the actual story now in significant ways, but I feel like it's uncomfortable. The whole question is uncomfortable, that for us to be comfortable with the way that a lot of things are in this world would not be right either.
Mm-hmm.
But that's part of what, I'm writing about things that I'm trying to understand that I don't really know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and I will say, rereading it again, I mean, your comment about humanizing people who it's very easy to dehumanize, and I think one of the things that I really appreciated reading your book again this time was that sense of not judging these characters, and really creating a space for them to be human.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be very easy to create a character like the father and to present him in a specific way, but I never felt like you were judging him, or that his actions were anything other than just a series of consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And I really appreciated that, and I think everybody that appears in the book, the same thing. It would be very easy to create these characters who exist as sort of composites and kind of almost cartoonish, but I appreciated that you didn't do that, because I think those characters, the characters on the margins, are the ones right now who need that grace and need that understanding. So I appreciate that. I want to wrap up because I know that this is a busy time for you. Maybe just very briefly, we've had somebody ask about your most recent book, which was Night Swimmers, which is very, very different, inhabits a very different world, right? Can you talk a little bit about that and what you've got coming up? What's on the horizon for you?
Oh yeah. What to say about the Night Swimmers? I guess what I would say is that and I think it's not just me, it's everyone, as you continue to work on something, on a series of skills, and as one gets older, I think that I'm becoming a much better writer. But really, what I know is that I'm getting much more comfortable in chaos. I'm getting much more comfortable in incorporating things or being patient or recognizing that I've been in situations a lot. And I recognize that where my writing goes wrong is where I'm anxious. And where I see my students' writing goes wrong, it's where when we're anxious, we revert to things we've done before or we've seen before. And you can't say to an anxious person, get more confident, like be more because you have to fail. You have to build up experience so you feel comfortable in that situation. The Night Swimmer started out as a book that was a very simple mystery about a potentially strange accident that happened while swimming in Lake Michigan at night. And it was informed by things in my life. I'm not comfortable writing about my life, or I'm not an autobiographical writer. But at the same time, there was a certain magnetism where people from that period of my life started contacting me, so there was a kind of archaeology of a past and a fictionalizing of a past, but also it's a story that is much closer to my life than anything I'd read that I'd written before explicitly. And it allowed me to, something that I think we all do, which is sort of recognize artifacts from our past and wonder, who was that person? How could they be continuous with the person I am now? And to sort of react to pieces of my life as the foreign things that they are, which doesn't make it sound like a novel, but it really is a series of love stories that takes place through time. It also involves parenting. My children are involved in it in various ways. And people from my past, it's very much about my dad died, and it's very much about the end of his life in some ways that are haunting it. But the next book, I have a book coming out in April, which is called Passers Through. And as much as I was talking about inspiration being a kind of reaction, I feel that most things that I write are a reaction to the last thing that I wrote. Like I've done this thing which felt a little bit self-indulgent. Now I'm just going to write a story that is the best story I can tell. So Passers Through is kind of, I haven't really talked about it yet, so I don't really have any kind of shtick. It's a story that takes place in Portland. It's about a father and a daughter who are estranged, but the father is about 83, I think. And they're communicating through faxes and through voice software. And he becomes involved with people who are actually squatting in a house and who seem to be taking advantage of him. But ultimately, it's kind of about the relationship between the living and the dead, I guess, how they communicate.
Great. And you said that comes out in April?
Yeah.
Great. Well, Peter, I want to thank you again so much for taking time out to chat with us about My Abandonment and about your creative process and what went into creating this wonderful book and this great story. Thanks to everybody for watching tonight. Congratulations, Belinda, on your. She just chimed in. Thank you, Belinda. And be sure to check back with us on September 21st for our program with Lee McIntyre on how to talk to a science denier. So until then, thank you, everybody. Have a great night, and we'll see you at the library. Good night, everybody.
Mm-hmm.